Hey everyone, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. I've got another amazing guest for you. His name is Mr. Jim James. He's at jimajames.com. And Jim and I are going to talk about the power of exposure, but we're going to talk about podcasting in general. And we're going to talk about something specifically about if you're the owner or a CEO of a company, why you shouldn't be doing your podcast, why you should have others be doing your podcast. So we'll go to Jim just in a moment. Those of you who are interested in having predictable revenue going on in your business, you're tired of the ups and downs. You know, it's like some months are great, some months are okay, some months are down. And you want that consistency going on in your business. There are reasons why it doesn't happen. And we have a metrics-based model that we can show and teach you on how you can have predictable revenue, whether it's through your sales teams or whether you're a solo independent business professional. Also, if you're struggling a bit on follow-up or a lot of bit on follow-up, we have developed a technology and we're releasing that technology. If you're interested in that, a SaaS technology where you can personalize and have meaningful and relevant and automated follow-up that will keep you top of mind and never lose a sale, never lose a relationship, gain sales and gain relationships, reach out to us. Again, you can send an email directly to doug@ceosalesstrategies.com and just let me know what you're looking for. Or if you want to hit the company directory, you matter, YOUMATTER @ceosalesstrategies.com. Let's go talk to Jim right now and get you more exposure and understand the world of podcasting a little deeper. Here we go. Hey, Jim, welcome to the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. Thanks so much for being here today.
Doug, thank you so much for having me on the show. I loved having you on the Unnoticed Entrepreneur podcast. So it's a real gift to spend more time with you. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I really enjoyed being on your show. And folks, I recommend you also listen to his show. It's a really interesting, I love your show. I mean, it's perfect. And the fact you're coming in from the UK, correct?
Correct. I'm from the west of England, a place called Wiltshire, just outside of Bath, the Roman city.
Wiltshire. Wiltshire? How do you say it? Wiltshire.
Yeah, Wiltshire. Yes, that's right. Or you Americans might say Wiltshire, I suppose.
Yeah, we have our own pronunciation of English words throughout.
Yeah, we're a common people separated by a common language, aren't we, I think?
Yes. I actually have a friend down in the south not Brighton, but to the west, more toward, I think, Portsmouth, if I remember correctly. And sometimes he gets talking and I can't understand a word he's saying. I know he's speaking English, but I know he's
Is that before or after he's been drinking beer? We're quite famous for our warm beer over here in cold weather. It's the wrong way around, really. We should have warm weather and cold beer, but there we are.
So yeah, I think it's a little both on his side, but I find that I'm so glad you would come on this podcast because I wanted to do a podcast on this particular subject, which is podcasting. Right? Why people should be using podcasting. I think you have a very unique angle on it. Why CEOs shouldn't be doing their own podcast, things of that nature. So why don't you tell people what you do and then let's get into the conversation.
Doug, thank you for that. Yes. Well, first of all, my life has been defined by an episode when I jumped out of an airplane at the age of 17 in the Kentish countryside, which is where I'm from originally, on the east coast of England. And I jumped out of an airplane to raise money to go to Australia. And it was that sort of 2 minutes that taught me the power of publicity to generate profits. And so I've been an entrepreneur, went to Singapore in 1995 to start my first business, and then went to China in 2006 to start another business, and moved back to the UK 2019. And I've always been surrounded by entrepreneurs. And, entrepreneurs are the people that I think change the world. And I think also entrepreneurs, too many of them, are unnoticed for what they do, Doug. So when I came back from Asia after 25 years of running businesses, I wanted to help other entrepreneurs to get noticed. So I started the Unnoticed Entrepreneur podcast, and I now have over 800 episodes for that show. It's in the top 2% worldwide. and I published 3 books along with publisher Wiley of the same brand. So really the whole purpose for me is the podcast, the books, and also I've launched a course called the Podcast Guest Blueprint, really helping entrepreneurs to learn how to find and how to pitch, but also really importantly, Doug, how to perform on a podcast and then to follow up. Because I've interviewed, as you have, literally hundreds, just about 400 entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, media training isn't something that entrepreneurs get on their budget list, right? In Asia, I used to train corporate CEOs because I ran a PR firm. And what I saw was this gap between what these CEOs were getting and what entrepreneurs need. And so I built a course. So I had this, you kind of referred to a unique perspective because I'm a host and I have guests coming on the show, but I've also done media training. So what I'm doing is really working to help entrepreneurs to make the most of being on podcasts. And as you said, Doug, without hosting their own. And we can dive into why I think CEOs and entrepreneurs should not own their own podcast, if you like, in a moment.
I would love to do that. And a couple of points that you brought up, the power of PR, right? Jumping out of an airplane. Now, everybody, you don't have to jump out of an airplane, but
yeah, it's much more pleasant to get in and get out on the ground. I can tell you that.
So I was in the military for 12 years, actually. And one of the things we all want to do is go to jump school. And so we were all pushing to go to jump school. And then the same week we all were pushing there. 2 people, actually, their parachutes didn't open. And one of them lived, one of them did not. And so we were like, well, maybe we should rethink this. Right? But the power of PR, what I love what you said there is that, because I'm forever preaching this, Jim, all people who are in any capacity of selling ever, whether just salesperson, CEO, whatever position, right? You could name the title. They need to be out in the public square today, and they need to be getting recognition. It's not the days of, hey, I'm a independent sales professional. I'm an independent business professional, or I'm even the CEO of a company or the owner of a company. The days of not being positioned, people are now, it's not there. In other words, we could get away with it 30 years ago. We can't today, because what's happening is people now, before they take meetings, they're looking people up online, right? So if they can't see somebody online, the credibility drops. And so we have to be out there in the public square. And I think there's no better master of the power of PR than Richard Branson. I mean,
Absolutely. Really a pioneer. And one of the things that I did, Doug, to sort of follow in his footsteps was I drove the first Morgan sports car, a British sports car, which looks like a 1940s automobile, into the Forbidden City in Beijing. I was living in China and I wanted to have a business with this car that I'd brought into China. So I drove it into the Forbidden City. And before the police, shepherded us on our way, we had a huge crowd, and I'd taken a film crew with me, Doug, as well, to film us driving into the Forbidden City. And we got amazing coverage on the magazines of this amazing car in front of the Forbidden City. So you don't have to jump out of an aeroplane because, frankly, that is a bit risky. You don't necessarily have to risk what I did, which is the kind of the ire of the Beijing police either. But this idea of doing something that's not just posting on LinkedIn, but something that pushes the envelope a little bit and gets some momentum behind you and the brand. So I've spent my life always trying to think of ways that I could have, if you like, a photogenic moment, let's call it that, a photogenic moment where you can maybe contrast yourself. For example, a classic British car with an old Qin dynasty emperor's palace. It's a great juxtaposition between the two. And so people want to write about it. People want to follow that. People want to read it. So for anyone listening today, publicity doesn't have to cost a lot of money. In fact, the best publicity is often free. And Richard Branson, you mentioned, he launched Virgin Airlines by going to Heathrow and having a plane outside by the terminal, and he stood naked.
Yep.
If you remember, he stood
I do.
naked because he
Yep.
said, we are not being allowed the landing slots that we should have because of British Airways. Didn't cost him anything, maybe a little bit of dignity, but memorable. So anyone that's thinking about PR, it doesn't have to be dangerous, doesn't have to be risky, but I just encourage people to have a bit of fun with it as well, Doug, right? Have a little bit of fun with your brand and not take yourself too seriously, and then, push the envelope a little bit.
So because when we're talking about jumping out of a plane, driving to a forbidden city, standing out naked, I can hear some people go, whoa, 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 whoa. No, 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 no. It's like pushing the envelope too much. What I want people to understand is you don't have to push the envelope a lot. You've got to be able to get noticed. And, so there are ways of doing that without jumping out of an airplane, like being on a podcast, like we're talking about right now, right? Um, when you're on someone's podcast and they have recognition, like Jim, you're in the top 2% of podcasts worldwide. I think we're in the top 2 or top 3%, if I remember correctly, worldwide. We have an inherent audience that now who know, like, and trust me, or know, like, and trust you. And so when we become a guest, we're getting immediate transfer of that trust and, to the other person, because we're essentially vouching and saying, hey, in this case, Jim James, expert in getting noticed and doing all of that. And I believe in him enough to bring him onto the podcast. So I want people to understand that there are different ways of getting noticed. You don't have to be to the extreme. You don't have to, everybody remembers Ozzy Osbourne biting the bird off, the heads, of the bird off, right? Or maybe getting arrested, for supposedly peeing on the Alamo, which he didn't do, in Texas, right? We don't have to rock star it all the time. Now, if you're comfortable doing that, great. You'll get noticed, out and above. But
But
there are ways of doing this, like you said, not just publishing a LinkedIn article, but if you want to stay on LinkedIn, how about publishing something that takes an opposing point of view that will get people talking?
yeah, and I think the thing here, Doug, is maybe if I can mention a couple of things, right? I mean, I ran a PR firm for 25 years in Singapore, China, and India that I built myself. There are a couple of things. One is that you don't have to do anything alarmist or anything radical, but what you need to do is do something that's not the same as everybody else. So if you look at it from that perspective, if you're trying to stand out, it's about saying, well, if everyone else is a 100, I just need to be 101, right? I just need to
Right.
be one point different, one shade different. So, you don't have to take big risks, but if you don't take any risks, you won't differentiate yourself, and so people around you won't know why you're different, right?
Right.
So I think in that sense, it doesn't have to be radical, but it at least needs to be incremental to everybody else, if that's more comfortable. And just the second thing I wanted to add was that, life is not full of daring moments, right? Richard Branson has had some, but the real work is in the day-to-day communication that you're doing, because we need to have, if you think of it like a forest, you might have a few really big redwoods, but you have a lot of small plants
Mm.
in the forest as well, right? Or in the edges. So your social media, you might have a few hero events, jumping out of a plane, driving into Forbidden City. But then also you need to have if like the undergrowth, you need to have the articles, you need to have the photo opportunities, you need to have the podcasts that you're appearing on, for example, because, the amount of content that people consume now is so great and it moves so quickly that if you only have one hero event every now and again, you're going to be so far down the search engine.
Yep.
And I guess the reason I'm thinking about this, Doug, is because I've been approached by a company to do some work for me. And so what I've done is I've gone online and I've checked on Reddit, on LinkedIn and Medium and so on. And they haven't posted anything for years.
Right.
And yet they're positioned themselves as a marketing consultancy that can help me with some of my work. And I'm going, but actually, you're kind of invisible. There's no thought leadership. There's, frankly, nothing to lend credibility beyond the presentation that they sent me. Right. And to your excellent point at the beginning, customers arrive already informed. Right.
Mm-hmm.
They no longer come to you to get informed. They come to you to make the final decision. So if you haven't created that depth of cover around your brand and your personality, they may not even turn up to that final meeting with you.
And that is so key of a point. And that's why I brought it up, Jim, because like even it never ceases to amaze me. This happens a lot to me, right? So I'll have a meeting with somebody that we don't know one another. They'll go look and check out things on my side. So they'll type in, Doug C. Brown, or Doug, revenue growth or whatever. And I'm like on the first 15, 20 pages of the search engines in there and on the pages. And they look through that stuff. Then they look through my LinkedIn. They look through everything that they pretty much can. And I'm surprised the things that they find, but one point keeps coming back over and over and over and over and over and over and over. I'd say 25% of people always bring up Berklee College of Music. You went to Berklee College of Music, Doug. And I'm like, yes. Now, I have degrees in nuclear medicine. I have degrees in business and finance.
And you look like Jean-Luc Picard. I mean, I thought you were going to say, people said, but you look as though you've appeared in Star Trek.
You are the second person who's brought that up.
Only the second? Okay. Well, your wife and I are in good company.
The interesting thing is I only went to Berklee College for one semester, right? I went to chiropractic college. There's a lot of things there, but they always cue in on this Berklee College thing, right? So it becomes a discussion point because they think I'm a great musician because I went to Berklee College, and I'm a good musician. I'm not a great musician, right? But I used to hang around with Boston, the members of Aerosmith, all of these. Nobody, that kind of gets bypassed a little bit. It always gets into Berklee College. And the reason I bring this up is, folks, you never know what they're going to cue in on. So you want to have, as Jim's saying, some aha things, and you want to have some tree cover as well as the redwoods in the forest, right? And it is so important and critical to do this today. I cannot keep saying this over and over and meaning it even more. It is the difference, as you said, Jim, between sometimes they will take your meeting and sometimes they won't take your meeting.
Yep.
And so, when you want to represent your brand in that capacity, you want to be doing certain things that represent that. And I'll give you another example. Out of my Instagram, we just did this. I was on a 2-week business trip, and I'm taking pictures with people who are semi-famous in the marketing industry or in the business industry. And those got some some attention. But then I was down on a beach in Florida, and I just decided to go like dance a little. And my wife was taking this video and these pictures, right? That one like shot right up, like shoot, like being the human being that we all are.
Yeah, and I think, Doug, you're absolutely right that we have to get this balance between being sort of very professional and being authentic. Yeah. Sometimes if the authentic, we've seen recently someone quite significant taking their kid to work, having them on their shoulders and talking about what they're doing to the American infrastructure, and is that authentic, or does it seem like a photo opportunity?
Right.
So we've got to think through about being authentic. And in fact, in the Unnoticed Entrepreneur Volume 3, I talk about how being authentic really is the superpower for entrepreneurs, which is, in a way, the best defense against AI, because being you is something that no one else and nothing else can replicate. And this, in a way, brings us maybe, Doug, on to our topic of being on podcast, because a podcast has an amazing opportunity for people to demonstrate their authenticity. Right. There is no filter. like there is with a traditional media. You give your story to a journalist and they try and write it down, and then they share what they think they heard with their audience, right? And that can be very, very frustrating for everybody. But with podcasting, you and I can have this conversation. We talk about nuclear medicine, we talk about music, we have about Jean-Luc Picard, but then other people can be a part of that conversation whilst we're having it. And the benefit of being on people's show and not hosting your own is, of course, that you're connecting with other people's communities. And this is a fundamental point because there are so many consultants selling CEOs on starting podcasts because, it seems like a trendy thing to do. But not everybody would become a publisher, right? Back in the day, we used to do newsletters for clients, and they could do 4 or 5 newsletters, and then they'd kind of run out of stories, right? And they'd run out of budget. Podcasting is just the same as the newsletter in a way. Not everyone should be a publisher. And so you can leave that work to people like you or maybe me that have really lent into podcasting. But if you want to build a brand, you can go into other people's podcasts, be authentic, and you're connecting, as you've done with my audience, Doug, and I'm now hopefully connecting with your audience too. And you get to meet new people, right? It's instead of hosting the parties at your house all the time, you're being a guest at someone else's party, right? And meeting new people. So I'm a huge fan, but there are 3 parts to being on a podcast. And if if you're interested, maybe we could talk about really sort of 3 aspects of being on a podcast that everyone should think about in order to make the most of it.
Let's do so. And what I wanted to let people know is, even if you have a newsletter today, if you're on a podcast, you can take that content and you can repurpose that into and make your newsletter out of that. We do this all the time. We will take this podcast and we will write something and we will feature Jim. We will talk about things on social media. We will post reels, right? So when you're on a podcast, folks, you can absolutely take and get lots of mileage out of the actual podcast in other capacities. So let's talk about the 3 things that people have to, the must-haves of podcasts.
Yeah. So I think, and just to let everyone know, on my website at jimajames.com/gift, there is a free download. And that download is a sort of top 10 tips for being a podcast guest. It's an interview checklist. Okay. And I'm sure Doug will put the URL in the show notes. But I'd like people to think of the fact that a podcast is a performance, Doug, right? And I have a whole course on this, an 8-module course on how to do this properly. But I know, I don't want to drive people to distraction here, but a key message I'd love everyone to think about is that a podcast interview is actually a performance. It's not a conversation. It is a conversation, but there are some things that you have to do on a podcast that you don't do if you just turn up to meet someone for a coffee. So beforehand, 70% of your podcast appearance is really in the preparation, Doug, right? So it's the lighting, it's the camera, it's the microphone, it's the framing, it's the knowing what your story is going to be before you get on, like I talk about jumping out of an aeroplane. And it's talking about what your key message is going to be so that people understand what it is that you're going to represent. So the first part that people must think about is that 70% of being a great guest is in the preparation. The second part is around being on the show itself. It's the grooming, what you wear, how you look. For example, I'm on every show with, you might notice, the same black sweater and white shirt.
I noticed that. Yep.
And that's because it creates consistency. I have other clothes. It's not that I've gone down the path of only wearing this, but people will see me in 30-second, 1-minute snippets all over the internet. And actually, what I'm hoping is that they will see me and it'll become consistent. So actually, it's part of your brand message, right? So mine is informal, casual, but also quite professional, right? So think about when you're on the show itself that you've got to be prepared technically, how you dress, and also that what you're going to say is going to add value to people. So you try and have just one or two key messages. And ours is going to be use podcasts for business development, which takes me on to the third part. Have something ready for the listeners to connect with you. I have been amazed, Doug, as I'm sure you have, as how many people go to a podcast interview without anything to offer the guests. It's a bit like going to a meeting and not having a business card. And people say, well, how do I get hold of you? You go, yeah, no, you can just take my number if you remember my phone number, right? I've mentioned I have a gift, which is a free download of an interview checklist. I always recommend to people to have something in advance prepared so that you are using the show to get people that are listening to the show to connect with you. If you don't give them a reason to come to your website, like to jimajames.com/gift, if I don't give them a reason, they're going to pass by, right? There'll be another podcast, another show to come to. So you have to give people some reason to connect with you and a place to connect that's easy to remember. And then the next part is just to follow up with the host. Say thank you. Ask them to give you a review of how well you've done on their show and anything you can do better. And the third part of that, of course, is what you've mentioned, which is repurposing your content. Because the podcast interview is so rich from a content perspective, Doug, isn't it? You've got the video, you've got the audio, you've got the text, right? And that's how I've made so much mileage out of my interviews. I have three books published as a result of being on podcasts and having guests. So before, during, and after, think of being on a podcast as a performance. And as you know, the old man used to say, if you don't look good, we don't look good. Well, if your guest doesn't look good, Doug, your show doesn't look good, right?
Right.
So if I turn up ill lit, the sound is poor, and I'm not making sense, your production team are going to have a really hard time making something that they want to put on your website, to put on your YouTube. We've all had those guests that you go, not sure I can use that footage because it's a bit blurry, or he came in and out, or maybe the dog kept on barking.
Yep.
And if it gets too much like hard work, the host will just not air the show. So I always say to guests, if you don't look good, I don't look good. But the choice is, if you don't look good, I won't help you to get the publicity. Okay. So big picture, Doug, I always say podcasts are a performance. How do you get your personality across so that other people want to connect with you in less than 20 to 25 minutes?
It makes total sense. Excuse me, makes total sense. And folks, I would double down on this with Jim and say, think about it. If you were going to be interviewed on a prominent television show, how would you show up? Right? Would you show up unprepared? Would you show up, in torn shirts and, messed up hair if you have it, like, even
I was going to say, Doug, that's not fair on you and me, that one. But even a sales meeting, you wouldn't go to a sales meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And this idea that you would turn up to an interview ill prepared or to anything, and especially because, and sorry to cut you off there, but video is becoming the medium of podcasts, and this is also really important for people to understand that people are making judgments about people on a 16:9 letterbox these days, right? So whether you like it or not, YouTube is the second largest podcast platform, right? So after Spotify, so most of us hosts are using video for our podcast, and if they're not now, they will do, because of course YouTube is the world's second largest search engine.
Right.
So if you want to be found, you're on YouTube. And so you've got to be thinking about how you look and how you sound, not just going, hey, cool, I'm on a podcast, let's have a nice conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so, again, important meetings, sales meetings, you're showing up on a first date, whatever, right? Like, just get that in your head and have something prepared to discuss, and have something that, imagine going to a date and then the date goes great and you don't exchange contact information. Like,
yeah, or you turned up and you hadn't had a shower and you just talk about yourself and ramble on for half an hour.
Yeah.
And that's another thing just to mention for people that don't know this. 30% of listeners to a podcast will leave in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah.
YouTube is even more punishing. It's 30% in the first minute will leave. Okay. So anyone that's listening to this, the reason that Doug mentioned me and I jumped in with my jumping out of an airplane story is because if I tell you about my life story about how I set up a business, you'll be like, oh no, not another one. Doug's got another boring guy, right? So you've got to think about your hook in the same way that if you were making a sales presentation, you probably don't lead with, hi, I've come to sell you something. Let me tell you about my product, right? You have a better opening line than that. And to your point, if you met an attractive potential partner in another social setting, you'd have a good chat up line. So think about that.
Yep. I will double down again on that, Jim, because it's so important. The average attention human span, it's less than a goldfish now, right? Microsoft did a study. It says it's, less than 8 seconds. And the reality is, think about it this way, folks. If you were in a crowded, whatever, a crowd of people on the beach, whatever, somebody sometimes will walk by and really catch your attention. Usually it's the person that's the most attractive that you're kind of like looking at, or it's the crazy thing, right? But that person that's very attractive, you want to be that person to everybody on that particular podcast so that they're queuing in and listening, because they're driving in their automobile, they're multitasking a lot of times when they're doing these things. So I absolutely agree with you, Jim. I found this one point that you wanted to discuss, because I wanted to discuss it because of such interest. Like, why should CEOs, owners not do their own podcast?
Okay, because they should be running their own businesses, Doug.
Yep.
And running a podcast takes time. I mean, I've run my own businesses for 25 years, but the idea of being mission critical to more than one activity is that it creates attention. There are going to be sometimes when you need to be running your business, looking after clients and cash flow and people and products, and sometimes when the show needs you talking to somebody. And people talk about you can outsource all the production and so on, and that's absolutely true. But then the show really isn't embodying the CEO's personality and spirit. It becomes kind of a fairly bland experience for the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So my view is that if you are going to be running a podcast, you really have to have the time to focus on it. And plainly, you're at a stage where your business, you're using your podcast as a lead magnet, but your business is at such a mature stage where you've got the time, and also you've got the personality to carry that off. And not every CEO is a natural raconteur, for example. Not everybody looks like Jean-Luc Picard and dances on the beach and gets filmed, right? So I think the thing is, focus on your own business, but also you can leverage the networks, because most people that are building businesses, they need to get more lead and deal flow. If you have your own show, by and large, you're talking to your own audience, right? By and large. So if your goal is to talk to your own audience and introduce new people all the time, then that's fine. But most CEOs are worried about growth.
Yes.
And how they're finding new inquiries and new leads. And the way to do that is to go on other people's shows. You look at people like Alex Hormozi, for example. He did, I think, 96 podcast interviews in 3 months to launch his book.
Right.
He didn't just have one show and invite everybody onto his show.
So the interesting part for me in this conversation, this is so self-serving on my end, is I've actually been thinking about maybe transitioning this podcast to getting someone else to do that, because we are now getting to a place in business where the podcast, it is, I love doing this, but at the same time, I can spend 7-8 hours a week doing the podcast. And it's like, all right, so if I focus that on rainmaking with other CEOs and companies, how much larger will we grow, right? And so
exactly. So the opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost of those 8 hours. And I think what we're seeing with podcasting is that it's becoming a more professional pursuit, right? There will be some people who, having done it during lockdown, then decided they couldn't do it anymore. Some people like yourself kept going
Yep.
and built it out. But then you're realizing to take your podcast to the next level, actually like a business, you need more time and more investment.
Right.
Right. So what are you doing then? What would you do with the CEO sales strategy, Doug? Where are you heading with that, do you think?
Well, I think if we're going to do that, and this is just started over because I was traveling over the last 2 weeks, Jim, and then it was just like chaos, right? And I'm in, meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and then it's like you go to the hotel and they're like, okay, let's hope the bandwidth is good and you can record it. That, all of these things that come up. And the other thing about a podcast, folks, is it's not just you, right? You'll have a production team, you'll have people who are coordinating meetings and coordinating scheduling. So there's more to it than just, hey, I'm going to start a podcast. If you want to get up into the top percentile ranks that Jim is in at this point, or we're in. And so I had thought about bringing a different host on to actually do different the subject matter that's pertinent to the show. And then maybe once a month I would do something like start to cut it back, and it'd still be part of the face, but it wouldn't be something. It more like there's a show in the United States called the Daily Show, right? And they do the news or whatever, right? And so they have different hosts that are on there. And so it's not just, the same radio personality or the same television personality showing up, right? And I've seen this done effectively before, but it is a way, and I want to let CEOs and business owners know that I've been on podcasts where the hosts, the owner of the podcast is not the host, and it's okay, right? It's like it's one of those things that just depends on how you want to position things. So that's what I have been thinking about, Jim,
Right. Yeah.
over the last couple of weeks, actually.
And I guess the question then is whether your podcast is an extension of your personal brand
Yes.
or whether it's an extension of your corporate brand.
Yes.
And, you have this question, which is why I started this idea of not being a host, because the danger is that you will come to this crossroads where then you will then be spending money on building the CEO sales strategy, which becomes really like having a freelancer to do your newsletter, right?
Yes.
It's, do you become a publisher or not? And that's a channel. So it's interesting that you're at that sort of crossroads, because plainly you've built a great show and you're an amazing guest and an amazing host, right? So anyone that has you, as I did, is very blessed to have you as a guest. But then if you could build it, could you make CEO sales strategy self-funding, right? Because
Yes.
then you start to look at the ROI on hiring someone to be a host at your kind of level, needs to bring the same amount of gravitas as you do.
Yes.
To engage the audiences in the same kind of way, right? So,
Yep. I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I'm the actual avatar, I guess, for the reason, right? And so if people are interested in doing podcasts and podcasting on their own, there is a fair amount of work to it in the beginning, especially. And so, and don't expect to monetize it right out of the gate, right? I mean, it could happen,
yeah,
but it usually takes time. Because Jim, I
completely. Yeah,
remember in our first year, we actually made $82,000 off the podcast in the first year.
that's
And
incredible.
yeah, and that's what a lot of people were saying to me. And I was like, oh, $82,000 for all this work, man, I don't think this is worth it, right? That was my
Yeah,
first thought
but
process of it.
but was that podcast related income, or was that people that became clients or customers because of the podcast?
Clients because of the podcast, right?
Yeah,
So
and that's a really key point of difference, Doug, because
yes,
I know that a lot of people use a podcast as a lead funnel. Okay.
yes,
And for me, that's slightly different, because then it's a glorified lead funnel, right?
yes,
When there's nothing wrong with that. But then if you spent 82,000, well, you earned 82,000, but if, as you say, how much time did you spend versus
yes,
if you'd done guesting, for example, and, LinkedIn ads or,
correct.
media relations, right? The
And
opportunity
that's
cost.
that's exactly where people should be looking, because they don't necessarily understand that when they get involved in the podcasting world. Um, and I didn't even know, Jim, I didn't even, it wasn't like I was asking for people, I didn't even know what I was doing at that point, right? Like I just was getting on and doing a real show with real people, and people were finding it, and they were reaching out and saying, hey, could you, help me with this or help me with
Yeah.
that, right? And that was wonderful. So and then then we started getting more like, oh, okay, we'll give some giveaways, we'll do this, we'll do that, all the things that you were just talking about. But when I talk to other podcasters, they're like, I haven't made $82,000 at all in my podcast. So it's one of those things that I just want people to understand. If you're going to be a CEO and you want to do it because you love to do it, it's great, but understand there is a time commitment to the process, the process. And and I like the idea about, are you going to build the brand of the company, or are you going to build the personal brand? Because if you want to build a personal brand and do the podcast, then you got to be there in most cases, and until your personal brand gets to a place where other people can, like Tony Robbins. I don't know if Tony, I mean, Tony has a podcast and someone else does it, from what I understand. So at least people know who Tony Robbins,
Yeah.
is. But for most people, they don't have that media exposure, so where they could do that. So,
Yeah. And I think where we're going is that this idea of a dual brand strategy,
mm,
that you have a personal brand strategy and a company brand strategy.
yes,
And this sort of idea of constructive distancing, that you can define yourself. The challenge is, if you as the entrepreneur are intimately involved with the clients, then it's good to have two brands, running side by side, and you're building one and the other, because they may not grow at the same pace at some stage if you
yes,
want to sell one or the other. But you have to manage the timing of that quite carefully, right? Otherwise, people are getting confused. Are they buying you? Are they buying the company? And the rest of the team feels like you're overshadowing. And we're seeing that with Musk at the minute, aren't we? We're really, his
hmm,
personal brand is actually detrimental to the Tesla sales,
yes,
from what I can understand, right? So,
yes,
so we started this conversation with, how to get noticed. And as you rightly say, a podcast is a great platform. The question is whether you have to own the platform. And for most entrepreneurs that I've dealt with, they like to be on podcasts. A few have tried them, but then after 6 to 12 months, they're finding that to take to the next level, they have to invest further,
of course,
both time and money. And then what happens is the show can drift away. So the other thing that you can do, Doug, is you can have a strategy where you say, I'm going to, for example, host 20 or 50 interviews. And what I've done is I had a strategy where I would host interviews with a view to making them into books. So I've done this. I self-published two, and then Wiley picked up the rights to the series.
hmm,
But one strategy is to have a quantified start and finish to your podcast experience, right? So rather just do it into infinity, you say, to give you an idea, a half an hour interview will give you about 12 to 1300 words usable copy from the guest.
yes,
You get 50 of those, you get about 65,000 words. You top and tail that, gives you 80,000, and that's 350 pages of book,
yep,
roughly. Okay.
yep,
So what I did when I was in the garden shed starting my podcast was I worked out how many interviews I would need to get my first book by doing the maths. So what you could argue, or what you could take as an approach, is say, I'm going to have the Doug C. Brown book. So I need maybe 100 interviews so I can get 50 that are really tight.
yep,
And then I can put that through I used AI, a mixture of tools, to then get a book that then I publish. In which case, the podcast isn't a means, or the podcast is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And you use the podcast as a way to acquire content in a structured way. But the goal is that then you can stand on stage and say, hey, I've got 3 books, and I've got involved, or with people where I'm hoping to do some work with them, and they're checking me out online, and they're like, well, you've got 3 books.
so you're an authority.
So that can then transform the experience all the way back to our point about some big trees and lots of undergrowth.
Yes.
Then you're really starting to get a few great redwoods in there because you're saying, actually, I've built an amazing forest of content, but some really, really tall, big pieces of content, which are these books. And the podcast can be used for that, Doug. Maybe what do you think? That may even be of
Well,
interest.
that's an excellent idea, especially for anyone who is an owner of a company or CEO of a company, or anyone who's being positioned, even if you're selling today in any capacity, even as a salesperson, to have your own piece of credibility like that. You can send it ahead of time, and it just positions very differently than without. Uh,
Yeah.
so Jim, how do people get a hold of you? Like they're like, I'm sure there are people going, well, okay, I know we're gonna give away the gift, but if they want to check you out, learn more about you, how do they do so?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Well, it's just jimajames.com. Very simple. So jimajames.com is my website. And on there they can find my books, my podcast, the courses, the academy. And this is the fun part, Doug. I now have a digital twin. I have an avatar. So what I've got on my website at jimajames.com is me. I've trained it and I've put all of my 800 episodes of my podcast, 3 books, and my courses and my other work into my avatar. So you can actually have a conversation with me by chat or by making a phone call. And you can ask questions, any questions about marketing, getting noticed, and you will get not just me, but the received wisdom of over 400 entrepreneurs giving you a response to your marketing problems.
That's awesome. Well, Jim, I want to thank you so much, sir, for being here on the CEO Sales Strategies podcast, bringing your A game. And I'd like to have you back on again if you're up for it. And again, thanks for being here on the CEO Sales Strategies podcast.
Doug, thank you for inviting me. I'm really, really delighted to have been a guest. And I hope that I made you look good today because that's what you deserve because you're an amazing host.
Oh, thank you, sir. All right, so I'd reach out and get that gift that Jim actually was presenting to you. And you can go get that at jimjames.com/gift. We're going to put that in the show notes for you. Uh, there are rules to doing podcasts successfully, and there are rules to not doing it successfully. And we figured out a bunch of these rules as we go along. And remember, you are entering into someone else's domain when you're becoming a guest. You want to be as professional and polished as possible and prepared as possible. It just goes well for the person who's running the podcast, and it goes great for you. And remember, you want to shine above everybody else that's ever been on that podcast, and you will get some recognition out of that, and you'll get additional exposure. So you want to make sure that you're in the public square. In the public square means that you're out there so that if somebody's searching on you, that they're going to find you and they're going to find all of these positive things that you're looking to have them, be surrounded with. You want to be surrounded with all of these positive things that when people go there and they're looking at you and other competitors, they're going, man, you know what? We got to go with you. That is the key in getting the exposure. And of course, it brings other opportunities that you may never have expected. I've had people, for example, they talk with me and then they go out and check out me online, and they see people I'm affiliated with, for example, or things that I've done for other companies, or certain things that I've published, and or certain even podcasts that I've been on. And all of a sudden, it just changes the dynamic from like, who are you to, oh, okay, this guy's actually got his brain in order, and let's talk to him in a deeper way, right? You want to have this done throughout your whole company, not just you, but everybody in your company. That makes a strong brand for your company. So, speaking of brands, speaking of getting out there, if you're struggling a little bit with I want to prospect better. If you're struggling a little bit with my messaging's not hitting right. If you're struggling a little bit with, I'm having all these meetings and they're not closing as they should. I promise you, in part, it's because you don't have a predictable revenue system in your business. Now, we teach you how to do that. if you're interested in learning that, or you're interested in, follow-up and our technology for follow-up, again, reach out to me directly at doug@ceosalesstrategies.com, or the company direct at youmatter, YOUMATTER, at ceosalesstrategies.com, because you do matter to us. Until next time, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast, saying go out and sell something, sell a lot of it, play win-win-win, right? 3 people win in the process or more. Don't discount, because you got to sell a lot more to make up for that discount. Remember to convey your value, get higher prices, higher margins, and you will work a lot smarter, not harder. Until next time, to your success.